All right, my clock just hit 1:15 here in Chicago, and so it is a pleasure to welcome many of you back to the Leading for Good 2021 conference. As you know, this year's conference is different than the past because we are virtual, and so we have spread it over 3 weeks and many sessions. We have had our Big Idea Power Chats over the last 2 weeks. Today is what we're calling our main conference with numerous sessions going on at this very moment. And if you are inspired by these first 2 weeks and feel like you want to be even further positioned at the intersection of business strategy and social purpose, next week we start our career coffees where you can talk to role models who are leading with business acumen for good in our world to see how you can further fit this into your career and your lives. I just want to mention that for those of you who are on our VFairs platform right now, there is a lot of on-demand content that we've already built up from the conversations we've had so far. So you can hear our conversation with Michael McAfee, who is the president and CEO of PolicyLink on advancing corporate racial equity. You can hear from Rashad Tabakawala, the best-selling author of How to Restore the Soul of Business. You can hear from Xavier Ramey, who is the CEO of Justice Informed and one of the foremost leaders of thinking about 1 year after George Floyd, how are we making progress toward our goal of racial equity? From Diana Aviv, who is the former CEO of both the independent sector and Feeding America on leading for social impact. From Annetta McCann, who talks about delivering on inclusion based on her experience as the Chief Inclusion Experience Officer at the Publicis Group. From Tonise Paul, who is the chairman of Energy BBDO and who talks about leading with meaning in business. But if you are here right now, you are here for a very specific reason. You are here because we have two of the leading minds in our world on the topic of philanthropy and who are right now giving a lot of people ideas and helping to move our country forward and how to rethink philanthropy with an equity lens. And I want to just say out loud how much I admire the two speakers today, Helene Gayle, who has been a trailblazer in medicine, in international development, and in social innovation, and now is bringing all of that to the philanthropy space, and John Palfrey, who is one of the leading scholars on tech and society, who has been head of school and who brings those experiences to the philanthropy space. And so as we talked about how lived experience really influences how we look at the world, there is an extraordinary number of experiences that each of them bring in addition to their identities to this work. And we are privileged for the opportunity to learn from them here today. And we are going to be learning from them with the phenomenal moderation of someone who is a staple of the work at the Baumhart Center, Brenda Asare, who is a leader on our advisory board, who is a thought partner from the very beginning. We met just weeks into this center coming to life, and who is one of the leading voices specifically on DEI in the fundraising space as the president and CEO of the Alford Group, one of the leading fundraising consultancies in our country. And so with that, Brenda, let me turn it over to you to get us into the discussion, and I'll be back later on to help facilitate some of the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Seth, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I am just so pleased to be able to have this rare opportunity where we have time to hear from Helene Gayle and John Palfrey. I want to say a little bit about both of them before we dive into our topic for this afternoon. Dr. Helene Gayle, epidemiologist, international public health expert, humanitarian, and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, one of the largest community foundations in the country. Dr. Gayle brings the same level of intensity, focus, and sense of urgency that she brought to fighting the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 90s as she tackles today's fight for racial equity. With piercing clarity, she's driving systemic change for Black and Brown communities in Chicago and beyond to, number one, address this city's most urgent problem in the post-pandemic recovery, closing the racial ethnic wealth gap. John Palfrey is the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a well-respected educator, author, legal scholar, and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning and education. John is not new to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Prior to joining the foundation, he served as head of school at Phillips Academy, Andover, the only school of its kind to maintain need-based admissions. In September of 2018, the campus quad was dedicated to Richard T. Greener, class of 1865, one of the first African-American students to graduate from Harvard, from Phillips Academy. Greener was the first African-American graduate of Harvard College and went on to become the dean of the Howard University School of Law. Thank you both so much for your willingness to spend time with us this afternoon to have this very important conversation. Well, without question, we are in a time when philanthropy, especially the influence and power it wields, is under scrutiny. As I prepared for our conversation this afternoon, it's really hard to miss the numerous headlines, articles, and interviews about this topic. Many of these stories highlighted the fact that funders hold power and resources and are not typically representative of the communities that they serve, and how important it is that they look inward and address issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Part of the push toward greater equity in philanthropy is recognizing the inherent power dynamics involved in giving people money and taking steps to shift the power into the hands of those you are seeking to help. This session is focused on rethinking philanthropy with an equity lens. So I'm going to go ahead and get kicked off. So John and Helene, please come off of mute. So my first question for you today, and John, we're going to start with you. What does it mean to you when we think about rethinking philanthropy with an equity lens? So what does it mean to you, and how has it played out within your organization?
Brenda, thanks so much for being here. It's an honor to be with you and with Dr. Helene, Gayle, and Seth and this great audience. I think you framed the conversation and the topic perfectly, which is to say it's the largest and most important, most pressing issue of our time in a broad sense, and certainly in Chicago and around the world where MacArthur operates, but very definitely for philanthropy. So for me, it means thinking about the way in which MacArthur Foundation can change the way we operate. That is also true for me as a white man of privilege, and how I think about my role, and for how each of the 180 staff at MacArthur do our work. And it starts, as you say, inside. It has started with a CROAR training that we've all done around how to be anti-racist, with every member of the staff has been required to do that. And as new people come in, that they're required to do this training. So we have a common language. We've looked at each of our practices in grant making, the way we invest our endowment, the way we do impact investing, the way we partner with others like the Trust in Chicago and elsewhere to make sure that we are doing that work in a transparent, accountable way. We're also mapping the way in which we make our grants across the city in partnership with the Field Foundation and others. I can go on, but I think the idea is to be hugely transparent about what we're doing, be accountable for what we're doing, and be leaders in this racial equity journey alongside and at the in teamwork with people like Helene.
I love it. Helene?
Yeah, thanks. And it's wonderful to be here with my colleague John, with you, Brenda, and thanks to Seth for the invitation. And I guess in many ways I would just say ditto to what John said. I think it demands of us to think about who we are as an organization, how we operate, how we think about our role as philanthropists, which is I often say philanthropy can be a very arrogant endeavor. You sit as judge and jury over people. And I think until you start thinking about how you look at the power dynamics that are inherent in philanthropy, it's hard to really talk about equity. And I know, we've been on a real journey, both internally to think about, as John mentioned, how do you give your team, and that includes our board, the language, the skills to think differently about power and power dynamics and equity. And then how do you adapt your practices accordingly? We're moving to much more participatory grant making, where we're listening to communities, and even our strategy, and we'll probably talk about that more. We took a long time to go out and listen to community and ask what people most wanted of us as an organization. And so I think it's really thinking from top to bottom, how do you look at those issues of power dynamics? How do you build capacity and agency within the communities that you most want to serve? And how do you think very differently about your role as a foundation so that we are really not looking at ourselves as all powerful, all knowing, and really looking and listening to the communities that we most want to be in solidarity with?
Yeah, that's wonderful. As a part of the lead into this, we talked about, looking inside in order to look outside. And as we look at the both of you, we can't help but to wonder in terms of your identity. Helene, as a Black woman, how did that inform your approach? John, as a white man, how does, what's the lens that you bring to this work? That both of you feel inform how you approach this work, because we can't escape our identities, right, to a certain degree. And so, Helene, let's touch on that. How did it inform? You knew what needed to take place from an organizational standpoint, but how were you informed by your identity in terms of the direction? Because there are certainly many steps you could have taken.
Yeah, so I feel we all bring our identities, who we are. It's part of who we are as individuals. It's hard to escape. I can't be anything but an African American woman. That's who I am. That's my experience. That's how I grew up. I grew up in a world that looked at me in certain ways that reflected who I was and how the world viewed me, and all of those things helped to shape who I am. I hope it gives me a certain sensitivity around the issues that we're trying to address, but I think it also sometimes is a double-edged sword. I knew that coming in, new to Chicago, new to the Chicago Community Trust, I couldn't just come in and say I wanted an agenda that focused on people of color, because I think people would have said, of course, it's our Black CEO who's coming in and talking about Black people issue. And I know, that can be, in fact, um, uh, counterproductive. I think back on my very first professional job and my very first evaluation. This is in public health. My supervisor gave me what he thought was a great compliment. He said, "It is so wonderful that you can talk about racial issues in a non-emotional way." And that was to say that as a Black person, I did not have the right to be emotionally attached to the issue of race. I am totally emotional about race. It is who I am. I have seen my what it means to be a Black person in America, and I don't take that lightly. On the other hand, I recognize that I cannot approach it in an emotional way and expect that I can bring all voices to the table. And at the end of the day, for me, it's around how do you make sure that everyone can embrace these issues, and how can I talk in a language that brings people in and invites them into the conversation. And so, it is for me always that balancing act between being who I am, identifying with who I am, but also recognizing that who I am can be threatening to others. And that what I most want is to have a dialogue that brings people into the room and doesn't push people out.
Yeah, that's so important as we think about, the construct of calling people in versus calling people out. And I know, on many levels, there's a balancing act, and we're hearing a lot about empathy and how we all need to, be more expansive in that area as well. John, what are your thoughts in terms of your identity, and how has it informed your work at MacArthur and beyond?
Brenda, thank you for the invitation to think about it. And first of all, I want to pay Helene a compliment for the amazing way that she both talks about racial equity here in Chicago, but also just looks out, I think, for everybody in the community. And as many people, I think, have been reading Heather McGhee's Some of Us, and I feel like that concept, Helene, you bring so much to your work, whether it's nationally leading a task force, to figure out on vaccine equity, how to roll it out, or here in Chicago. You just do an amazing job of that. I'm proud to be your partner In terms of my own identity as a white man of privilege, a straight white man of privilege, I know that when I walked in the room at MacArthur, it was not a popular choice among many because of that identity here in Chicago and elsewhere in philanthropy, and that's something I've had to grapple with. It's also, I think, as Helene says, it can be both a double-edged sword. All of our identities can, which is I'm deeply committed to the racial equity work that's at the center of our work at MacArthur Foundation, the Just Imperative, which got kicked off by my predecessor and fellow speaker here, Julie Stash, and many wonderful staff people at MacArthur Foundation have had that going, and we've been able to extend that, I think, well. I also think there are times and places where it's, it is always been, it is today, helpful to be a white man of privilege. Sometimes you can do things that you can lean into that authority, not for good reasons, but just because that's still the world we live in. And I've tried to think about how can I use that identity for good and to be a part of this racial equity process and really make change. And Brenda, you mentioned something no one's ever mentioned in an intro before, the naming of the Richard T. Greener Quad at Andover. We also named our health center for a Black woman who worked there for a long time. Those were things that I could do, and nobody said, John, you're the person who did that. That was just something that needed to be redone. That was a racial equity statement, and something that I had the great authority and privilege to be able to do.
Yeah, I want to encourage our attendees to please put your questions in the chat. We will have time to have some interaction with Helene and John, but I also want to encourage you to put questions in the chat as well so we can get to as many as possible. When we talk about what's going on in philanthropy right now, we all have been reading about this idea of flipping the switch in philanthropy and how individuals are approaching it, how businesses are approaching it, all the statements that are coming out where everyone wants to, communicate that they're being equity forward and equity centered. And I, with any kind of switch, there's a possibility and probability of switches going on and off, right? So when we think about what's happening now in the sustainability of the work that everyone is leaning into, I'm curious to, what you see as the sustainability of this movement toward equity and philanthropy. Is this a moment or is it a movement? So what are your thoughts? Helene, where are we on this?
Well, I think whether it's a moment or a movement is really up to us. It can be a moment if we let it be a moment. It can be a movement if we all work together. I think stacking the decks is the best way to do it. I think that if we have organizations who have people who have a connectedness to these issues, whether it's through their lived experience or, their personal commitment, that we have our boards, that of our organizations who, also are equally committed and have people who, have a real commitment to this. So, I think it is partly about, at the end of the day, people are what make anything happen. And if we have the right people and the people with that kind of commitment, I think we can create a movement. But I think it is going to take that. And also, I really do think it's both bottoms up and top down. How do we do this from where we are in our lens? But also, how are we making sure that at the community level, we are giving the kind of support that allows people to really have the agency to move these issues forward. And so a lot of the work that we do now, which, at first I think people wondered when we started talking about funding community organizers and looking at, grassroots narratives and how are you really building that kind of grassroots power. I think it takes that. And so, again, I'm thinking, how do you stack the decks? How do you make sure that at every level there are, people who are committed to this and who aren't going to let up the fight?
Yeah, I'm so encouraged to hear that. As a part of our work with the Alford Group, we partner with organizations across the country. And certainly one of the areas where we have found for some of our clients who work in the area of grassroots and advocacy, oftentimes those are the most difficult dollars to achieve and they turn themselves into pretzels. but we need the grassroots efforts. And I'm so happy to hear that there's an opening opportunity for organizations to have their work be recognized and supported. So thank you for that work that I know that you're doing, as well as the work that MacArthur is doing. John, you want to talk about, is this a moment or a movement as we maintain sustainability of philanthropic equity?
Absolutely, Brenda. And as we talked about in our prep session, there's probably not going to be a lot of disagreement between me and Helene, and certainly not on this topic. So I absolutely agree that it will be a movement if we make it a movement. And there are lots of things we can do. I like the idea of kind of baking in processes and practices, and through training, the commitments in individuals, and then supporting up individuals from a variety of diverse backgrounds and lived experience and so forth into positions of leadership. But just take a particular example that we're involved in a collaborative way around Chicago. So for now a couple of years, we've been doing a way of doing our arts and culture grant making. We flipped it to be culture equity in the arts. And now the decisions for who gets the general operating multi-year support from MacArthur is made by a diverse group of people in the arts around the city. When we had a chance this last year to raise some money, which we did through debt, give out more money and highlight some cultural organizations that are led by people of color, which we've done through a national effort and grounded it here in Chicago called Chicago Cultural Treasures. That process, in partnership with others, has again been done in a deeply participatory way. So I think to Helene's point, if you change the processes and practices in one instance, it can have effect in the next practice, and then and so forth. And I feel like that's our job in this moment as leaders, create those practices that are actually going to work really, really well. So I just take that example of the arts in Chicago as something I think is quite transformative.
It's encouraging to hear how foundations are really working together during this moment. And I don't know if that's always been I know that you all, talk to each other, but I mean, would you say that there's even increased degree of collaboration in this time because of the work that everyone is doing? So I want you to both address that, and then I also want you to share with us. You both have made this work sound pretty easy within your respective organizations. Like everyone was ready, the board was ready, the staff was ready. John, I heard you talk about staff all undergoing anti-racist training, but there are some realities to this work in terms of what we might call headwinds that may create challenges. And I know that there are a number of people on this phone from across the country here in Chicago where they haven't been able to achieve some of the successes and gains that you both have as institutions. So first speak to the value of the collaborations that you both, I know, have been very actively and leading on. And then what are some of the headwinds that you've had to deal with in moving this along?
Yeah, and they're somewhat interconnected, I guess. First of all, I would say when I came to Chicago, now it will soon be 4 years, I was impressed by the collaborative ecosystem that exists. I mean, Chicago, I think is unique in the cities that I've lived in terms of how people work together, how deeply people care about their city, their region, and how we have a business ecosystem that I think is exceptional, where people kind of assume that part of their job and part of their role is to think about community.
Yes.
And clearly within the philanthropic community, there's a great sense of collaboration in ways that I think are unique and really important. I do think that with this focus on equity, it has increased that collaboration, because I think when you have a something to anchor collaboration on, it is much deeper and much more significant than just, well, we do this because this is what we do. Now we're all kind of moving in this similar direction. We're doing it in different ways. We take different pieces of the puzzle, but this is something that we can all anchor our collaboration around, and then I think it becomes a lot more meaningful. But to your point about the headwinds, first of all, there's two or three major headwinds. First of all, we don't know, this is something we've never done before, and we don't
Right.
know how to do it, and we don't know how to do it well. We know that we're moving over the next 10 or 15 years to being a majority minority nation. We don't know what it means to be a functioning multiracial democracy, and
No.
there's really
Yeah.
not a good example anywhere in the world
Right.
of how to do that and how to do
No.
that well. So, I think we have to acknowledge that we're all on unfamiliar territory, and it's incredibly difficult. You mentioned Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, and she makes this argument that we have this zero sum thinking here, that if one group does better, the other group loses. And it
Right.
is so deep and so profound within the psyche of America that I think thinking about how we shift that zero sum thinking is going to be critical if we really want to move to another, get to the other side of this. We've got to recognize that we will all benefit
Right.
if the least of us or those who have been held back benefit, and that it doesn't take anything from us. I mean, we funded this study with Metropolitan Planning Council a few years ago, the cost of segregation, that showed that the degree of segregation in Chicago and Chicago region cost the region upwards of $4 billion of GDP a year. That's for everybody. That doesn't just hit Black and brown communities. That hits our region. We're 67th among the 100 largest metropolitan areas in terms of economic growth, and you can go on and on and on about how being holding back two-thirds of our population really does hurt us all.
Mhm.
And if we gave opportunity, it would help us all. So I think we've got to think about these things and shift our mentality if we are going to get to a point where, as a multiracial democracy, everybody is entering into that democracy. Everybody feels like they have a stake in it. Everybody
Right.
feels like they have some hope.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going to really, once again reclaim, who we are as a nation in so many ways. So.
Wow. John, your thoughts?
I was on a call recently with some senior leaders from the White House with a very small number of philanthropists looking at racial equity. And the example that this official gave was We Rise Together in Chicago, led by Helene Gayle. And Helene didn't even know that this person knew what she was up to. But
Wow.
Chicago is unusual in a wonderful way in terms of that collaboration, that we are willing to give millions of dollars to a third party, one of us, into, and then having a group of people from the community think about how to give that money away to
Yeah.
drive a racially equitable and inclusive recovery. That is great. But it is not to say this is easy in any way. And I saw a comment in the chat about the power of emotion and how challenging this is for individuals. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we have to be able to bring our emotion to the work. I also think we have to acknowledge the fact that maybe 50% of the country agrees with what Helene and I are saying, and probably 50% don't, right? We are a divided nation and world in some ways. And that is, there's a real headwinds, and the hundreds of years of racism that are endemic in our systems and structures all have to be taken out. We have to deconstruct all that and reconstruct a better society. So this is, we're talking with real force and emotion and power right now, I think, but it is also the case that there are serious headwinds, Brenda, as you suggest with your question.
Yeah, when we talk about, a multicultural society and what the future is going to look like, one of the things that comes to mind for me is the whole risk tolerant and how tolerance and how organizations perceive risk. And I would love, do you have any thoughts around risk? How did you, when you were, setting about your agenda, looking at the collaborative opportunities, looking at deconstructing what we know, was risk a part of the consideration? And what did you see as the risk or the loss? Or what do you think others see as the risk or the loss to this deconstruction? And as I've heard Dr. Gayle, building back better.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I think we have to think differently about risk, Brenda. I think our old way of thinking about risk is, oh, if we make this mistake, we give a bad grant, somebody's going to get mad at us. We have to throw that out the window and say, of course, we'll make some bad or whatever grants that won't work out the way we thought we would. The bigger risk is not doing something about racial inequity. It is about not doing something about the economic inequity in the city. As Helene said, we're at a place where the status quo is so bad, and the idea is if we can bring everybody up and our society up, there's going to be huge opportunity there, but there's a huge risk to staying where we are. And it's a risk to people's lives and gun violence. It's a risk to people's economic security. And as we've seen, it's a huge risk to people's health. So the bigger risk is not doing something.
I agree with you.
Yeah, wholeheartedly. And I guess, philanthropy is always supposed to be able to be risk capital, and we're supposed to be able to take the risk that others can't. And I think over time, philanthropy has gotten very risk averse. And, I think this provides us an opportunity to really show what can philanthropic capital do to de-risk some of the things so that others can join. And as John said, I liken it to the COVID vaccine. People who don't want to take a COVID vaccine worry about, some infinitesimal risk. And I'm like, the disease is much better, is much greater risk. That's a big risk to take versus taking the vaccine. And so I think it's, to me, it's equivalent. It's like, there's some risk. We may put out some grants. They may fail. We might trust the wrong organization. They may make, but, the risk of inaction. And, I look at parallels, when you're talking about venture capital, what is it? 90% of ventures fail and only 10% are successful, but we keep putting money into, interesting new projects and new companies. We're willing to take a risk on those, but we're not willing to take a risk on building a better society. I mean, it's a risk I'm willing to take.
And Brenda, if I could just add one thing, I agree with that venture example so much, but we're also willing to take a risk on almost exclusively white and Asian men in the case of venture capital, right? That we're willing to take risks in that zone in an incredibly segregated field, whereas we're not in other fields that actually are more diverse. We have to ask ourselves, why do we take the risk there, but not this perceived risk in the social sector?
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, any person of color or woman always knows the situation where one of us fails, and we know that means that for the next decade there will never be another person who looks like us. But if you're a white man and you fail, nobody is saying we won't put a white man in that role again. And so I think this notion of risk and thinking about what are we willing to put at risk and what are we not willing to put at risk, and what does that say about our values and our sense of equity?
That's leading into my last question before we participate with our audience. And the question is, where do you see the biggest opportunities for the collective we to reimagine the future of philanthropy? What must we do in order to have things be different? It's going to take all of us at the table.
Well, I love Brian Stevenson's sense of getting proximate. And, I think part of what it is going to take is for everybody. And John, I think you said earlier, or maybe it was Brenda, I forget. Anyway, the sense of empathy. How do we actually get out of ourselves and appreciate someone else and, really get close to people's living situations so that we see them as human and we see them as extensions of who we are, right? It's why I love this project, the folded map that Tonica Johnson, the photographer, has, where she basically, does photography as if the map was folded south and west coordinates, and bring families who have the parallel address on the north side together with families who have the parallel address on the south side, and start building that sense of common humanity and understanding each other. And so I just think all of us being willing to step outside of where we are a little bit and really start thinking about how do we develop that sense of connectedness, I think is at least a start.
Yeah. I love common humanity. Wow. John?
Amen. I cannot improve upon that answer.
I know, I know. Well, I just again want to thank both of you for spending time with me this afternoon and our other 124 friends this afternoon, just sharing your great thoughts about where we are and how we're going to go even further together. So Steph, I'm going to turn it over to you and open it up for our participants now to engage with Helene and John.
Wonderful. Well, this has been an extraordinary conversation and not surprisingly generated a lot of discussion in the chat. And so we're going to get to as many of the questions as we can. And Bridget Carney, I saw yours first. I'm going to spotlight you here and you can ask directly.
Thanks so much, Seth. Hello, everyone. This has been so enlightening and really wonderful the whole day, and this session especially. I'm a current Baumhart Scholar, and I work on the corporate partnerships team at Feeding America. So my questions are around, for nonprofits and fundraisers, kind of like, I guess, any just recommendations in working with corporate partners and working with donors as we move towards this maybe different power dynamic, and we're all in different parts of our equity journey. And so I know I can find it challenging at times working with donors and corporate partners kind of at all different parts of this journey. So just curious if you have any kind of tips or insights kind of along those lines.
And maybe just to broaden that a bit, because I see there are quite a few fundraisers in here. How do you think about this from the other side? How can kind of fundraisers live these values even with their own role in these power dynamics?
I'll say, because as the community foundation, we both bring in money as well as, put money out. And so we do have a philanthropic services. We work with donors. Many of them, have their own ideas about where they want to use their dollars and what they want to support in communities. And, one of the things that we would love to see more of our donors go on the same journey and want to be involved in it. But I think it's about starting with where they are. And, I think, when we developed our strategy for the foundation about 2 years ago, we decided to focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap because we felt that was kind of key in this region, and it was kind of a core fundamental root cause of so many other issues: education, health, public safety, etc. But saying to some audiences closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap may close them off. They may shut down. And I've had questions saying, well, why do you only care about Black and brown people? Why don't you care about poor white people, etc.? And I think the argument has to be made from where somebody is. If you say, again, 2/3 of our population is Black and brown, and if they get left behind, it has an impact on our whole economy. I think people start to understand it differently because they look at the statistics. They see we're losing population. They see that we're losing GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. And if you start talking about it from the perspective of how does it help everyone, I think you start piercing some of the objections that people have. I also recently was listening to a very kind of famous person in this equity space, John A. Powell, who's at Berkeley, talking about targeted universalism. And his notion is that you don't say, we're going to do something that is a race specific initiative. You say, we want everybody to have a good quality education. But to get there, for some populations, it may take a certain specific initiative. But the goal is that we want all children to have high quality education. It's hard to argue with that. So I think if you start the premise from what do we all want, and then say that for all of us to get there, we may need to do some special things for populations who, have different needs, who've been left further behind, et cetera, I think you can get there. So, not hammering people on the head with where we're starting, but thinking about what makes a difference for them and where they're starting.
John, do you want to add, or should we go to the next question?
Yeah, so it was such a good question, and I think Helene's answered it really, really well. But Bridget, I just one thing I would just note: I've spent many more years on your side of the table than on the side I'm on now, which has been about 18 months. And I would just say, remember, as always, that it's a human being on the other side, and that I will say in my seat, 90% of my conversations, particularly with grant seekers, I have to say no to stuff I really think is great. And that is just the reality of what we're trying to do. And part of what MacArthur's trying to do with our Lever for Change affiliate is try to get more donors in doing the work we're, all of this. So we're trying to get just as Helene is. And it's just, I am asking for that same empathy and universalism and grace and so forth. I think that we're talking about. And on the racial equity front, if it's just something that an organization is faking or adding in or asking us just to pay for the diversification of their staff, which I've gotten 3 times in the last few weeks, that's not going to work, right? We know if this is actually at a really core thing to the organization and its work. I think that deep human connection and real focus on the depth of the work is crucial.
Our next question comes from Yolanda Collins. Yolanda, do you want to share who you are, and then we welcome your question.
Hi, good afternoon, Seth and panel. Great discussion so far. I'm actually a part of the purpose-driven program at the Baum Center right now. And so my question is really focusing on, and I am currently also with Stanford Healthcare in the Bay Area. So right here on the front line, my question is also centered around how businesses as well as nonprofit have made statements during this last year of crises related to race and equity and inclusion. And so how can businesses really take more of a leadership role beyond making those statements? So for example, when we had the sustainability issue, I saw giant corporations move nimbly. It wasn't overnight, but 10 years ago to now, they have made a commitment, they put the money behind it, and their businesses are nimble because the consumer and the community demanded it. So how can we do the same thing when it comes to equity and inclusion and get past the statements and really, really shift our communities so that they are aligned with what our consumer base is asking for and demanding?
And as 2 leaders of philanthropy, I'm especially curious to dig into, what role can philanthropy play in catalyzing some of that? And not to put you on the spot, Dr. Gayle, but I know, the trust has really been thinking a lot about partnership with business, and as part of that broader vision of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, how you can help to move this along in business from the outside, so to speak.
John, you want to start? Or?
I'm happy to. Yolanda, it's such an important question. What I've said to the team at MacArthur, who are amazing and devoted to this, is let's not say anything that we're actually not doing or can't do in the near term. Like, we have to say stuff and then be accountable to it. So if we're going to say we're going to do more of this, we got to put real money behind it. And I do believe with the $125 million in debt that we raised last year for the first time, and I believe we are doing that, but I feel like everybody has to be accountable in just that way. One thing I would hold up for all kinds of organizations is the work to ensure that we have a more diverse set of suppliers and people who are working with us and partners in every way. Business diversity, as John Rogers of Ariel Investments calls it. Ariel has this effort called Project Black, Ariel Alternatives, to try to ensure that all of those companies that have made these statements, in fact, have companies that they can invest in at a very big level and to use as partners. I'd hold up Don and Liz Thompson are doing something similar here in Chicago, maybe a little bit more in the middle market scale, and what Helene and I have been working on with ARC and Benefit Chicago in terms of making those kinds of investments. So I think that there is so much opportunity, so much, and we have to figure out how at every level of the stack, using every part of our balance sheet, every part of what we do, that we are a part of this racial equity work. And I think everywhere you turn, there are opportunities, particularly in those sort of business partnering sector.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're both doing, and others, looking at who invest our dollars, for instance, are we going to businesses, money managers of color and women, to to handle our investments. So I think there's whole sorts of ways in which we can use all of our organizations. I also think, to your point about sustainability and the parallels, businesses started moving towards sustainability when they believed that it mattered for their bottom line. And I think that, the arguments around diversity started out primarily around fairness and justice, which, I believe in. I wouldn't be doing the work that I've been doing for all my life if I didn't. But I think businesses do, individuals within businesses may think about, the social and the right way of doing it, but the business as an entity has to think about profit. And I think if we, do a better job of making the economic case for diversity, and it's real clear now. I mean, and even down to the neuroscience and behavioral science, why it matters to not have people who have the same experience solving the problems. You don't get the same quality of answer if you have groupthink and if you don't have people who bring different perspectives to the table, et cetera. And there's study after study now on board composition and what companies do better if they have more diverse boards and more diverse management teams. So I just think continuing to make the case for why it matters, and including putting it into incentive and performance evaluations, the same way sustainability metrics are now starting to be part of compensation. So I just think there are many ways to drive that behavior and use the data that we have to do that.
We're now going to go to MK Racine for her question.
Hey there. I was very interested in the emotional component. I think in the CSR space, you have people who are very strategic, people who are highly energetic, those are very caring, and people who are really decisive and can make decisions and make some change. I'm the more like lead with yellow energy and decisive. And so I can do that and very caring in the personal realm, but it's hard for me to not be emotional in this space. Even as I talk about it, I can be very decisive to get things done. But if I'm talking to people where I need support for something and they're trying to be open-minded, but they're just not there for whatever reason, however they show up in the world, I find my pace and speaking, increasing, my inflection, I talk more with my hands. I can't help but become emotional. So in trying to be strategic, I mean, you can plan ahead, but when you're in the moment, it's very challenging, especially when we have extremely vulnerable populations, and it is an emotional thing, it's a human thing. What is your advice for that?
I guess I would say emotion's not all bad. I think people appreciate authenticity. And so, I think, bringing who you are, bringing your emotion to it, bringing your authenticity to it actually helps move people. And, I think we all struggle with, checking our emotion in ways that are counterproductive. But I think that emotion that helps develop compassion and helps people appreciate the depth of your caring and concern isn't a bad thing.
I agree with that totally. And, MK, I really appreciate your vulnerability, and you're raising this question in a public and recorded session. It's an impressive thing to do. A, and B, one thing I brought to our team when I first became leader at MacArthur, as I said, we're probably historically mostly making intellectual decisions. MacArthur's thought of this brilliant place, MacArthur Fellows, all that stuff, probably a lot of head stuff. And I said, I really think the head, the heart, and the hands are going to matter in this work, particularly when we get into this racial equity work. And we need to have heart in there. And I think we need to see heart of those who are our partners too. And if we're just pretending that we are just intellectual, my hunch is that's a vestige of white supremacy and a vestige of an old way of doing our work. Now, obviously, can there be a limit to how much emotion we have. Of course, there could. We all know there are times when it's inappropriate to share in a certain way or to a certain extent. But I do think having some degree of that in the mix and actually reacting to it in appropriate ways is really, really important. So I'm grateful for you raising it. I think it's an important topic, and I do think it's connected to this racial and ethnic equity journey, because I think it may be about different, challenging a paradigm that we've had, or challenging an approach that we've thought is what professional looks like in the relationship that we're in with philanthropy and people doing good.
Thank you both.
Caitlin Klosser, you have our final question.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to hear from both of you. Thank you for your wisdom today. My name is Caitlin Klosser. I'm with United Way, and I was just curious about if you could name an organization or entity that that you're currently funding that you think you wouldn't have found without this intention towards racial equity.
Gee, you should probably be talking to my grant making staff, not me. But I guess without naming specific names, as I mentioned before, we have this network called of change makers. And, I think it's one of the things when we were first doing our strategy and laying out the different pillars of our closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. The first one was growing household wealth. That was pretty tangible. It's about supporting small businesses, home ownership, income, erasing debt, things that people can count and measure. The second one was around catalyzing neighborhood investment. Again, something that people understand. You're going in and changing the physical infrastructure of disinvested neighborhoods. But the third one, building collective power, was the one that I think people scratch their head the most about. What does it mean to build collective power? And I think it's actually ended up being the one that people are most intrigued with and has in some ways moved us the furthest, because we are funding grassroots organizers, particularly young people, young change makers. We're working with hyper local media who can really tell the narratives of communities from their own voice. And, time doesn't permit, but I could give stories of how something that appeared in, the Tribune that was then written from the vantage point from the communities themselves, you get a totally different story, a totally different connection to the story in ways that, I really show why raising the voice of community themselves is so important if we really want to understand what's going on. So I think that whole realm of how we have really moved into more grassroots organizations and looking at how we build power at the community level has been a real game changer for us.
And what I'd say is, linking back to some previous comments, as we're trying to do more transparency and accountability in our grant making, as we now publish, we've long published all of our grantees, but we have a demographic survey that's on our website showing, the demographics of our grantees as well as we can. As we are doing that, we are obviously part of that is to say we think that we have the demographics wrong right now, right? We look a lot like the demographics of the sector, and particularly as we want to be on an equity journey, that's got to change, right? So it's very specifically trying to shift it. And one specific example I'll give you, as part of this COVID-19 response we've done to bring about a more racially equitable and inclusive recovery, we made a grant, $3 million to something called Democracy Frontlines Fund. DFF was a trust-based effort where we handed the money along with 12 other foundations, $36 million in total, to a group of BIPOC women who decided the 10 organizations, also led by people of color, who should get it. So we took the power that we had, gave it to a bunch of other people, and then they made the grants. Of those 10, I'm going to be with Helene and not name the names of the orgs, but of the 10, which you can find at democracyfrontlinesfund.org, I believe 3 of them we had funded before or knew well. So I think, by extension, there certainly were several there identified by this group of women of color who said, okay, this is where the money should go right now to be part of this recovery. So that would be an example, I think, where the racial equity journey and these commitments we've made have led to the money directly being shifted to other places. So just as an example.
Thank you.
Well, this has been an extraordinary discussion, and I want to turn it back over to the real moderator here, Brenda Asare, to close us out.
Thank you so much, Seth, and thank all of you for your wonderful questions and your comments in the chat. I'd like to close us out with a couple of quotes. As I said before, both Helene and John are not new to this landscape of really elevating diversity, equity, and inclusion. John, I found a quote, a recent interview with the Chicago Tribune. The quote is, "We need to turn our righteous anger into righteous hope and transform that hope into sustained action that adds up to real change in the world." Helene, a recent interview with Candid. "So we really have to focus on and lean into how we are working with those communities and make sure we are doing it in a way that builds trust, not only for the duration of this pandemic, but for the next crisis and the one after that." Both of these quotes reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, which is, "Change happens at the speed of trust." And indeed, we go further together than alone. So I'd like to thank both of you for spending time with us, for your commitment to elevating equity as core to who we are as part of our humanity. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. So again, enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you all for all the great work that you're doing on the fronts that you're leading. So thank you, each and every one of you. Peace to everybody.
Thank you, Brenda. Great job.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.